Um, Hello, everyone. I'm glad to present this paper, which we are now about to finalize. And I'm glad for you attending the session during this busy end of the year time. So this paper is titled False Consensus Beliefs and Populist Attitudes. And as Marlene mentioned, it is joint work together with Claudia Landwehr and Philipp, who are also from the University of Mainz. And we are, as I said, currently finalizing this paper. So the paper is not finished yet. So everything that you comment or any question that you might have could still be incorporated into the paper. So I really look forward to any sets of comments or questions that you may have. And this is also part of a larger project where we also want to collect additional data. And we are also planning to run experiments. So there's also a chance for you to influence what we do in addition to this particular paper in the future. What is the paper about? So the paper is about a well-known tendency that human beings overestimate support for their own views. And in social psychology, this is really a well-known tendency, and it goes by the name of a false consensus effect. And in the paper, we speak of false consensus beliefs, because this is essentially about the beliefs of people and the idea that the beliefs of people are biased towards their own views. And our starting point for the paper is that while it is well established that this tendency exists, that people tend to have false consensus beliefs, that they overestimate the support for their own views, there's not really much research on the political consequences of these false consensus beliefs. And this is where we come in with our paper, where we want to especially look at an impact on populist attitudes. And we think that these false consensus beliefs, the idea that there's much more support for your views outside from your own perspective, but also others supporting your views, might actually be an important cause of populist attitudes. And in the paper, we tried to test this using survey data from a German survey, the GESIS panel, and we fielded items inside this panel in 2021. And what we did was to measure these false consensus beliefs and then measure populist attitudes. And in the paper, we basically test whether there's any sort of robust association between these false consensus beliefs and populist attitudes. So let me talk a bit more about this idea of false consensus beliefs. As I said, this is really a well-established tendency, which is well-established by classic research in social psychology. So there's a seminal paper already from 1977, a paper from 1985, which actually did a first meta-analysis summarizing the many studies documenting this tendency that human beings tend to overestimate how many others support their own views or have the same views as they have. And there are, generally speaking, two sorts of mechanisms of how these false consensus beliefs may arise. On the one hand, we may think of it being a consequence of motivated reasoning. So this would be the perspective that basically people want to believe that their views are not isolated views, but that many others actually support the views that they have. Or to say it from the other perspective, people may not want to admit to themselves that they have views that are not shared by any other persons or by only a minority of persons. So that would lead us to expect that people overestimate how many others agree with their views. And then there's the second mechanism which might lead to these false consensus beliefs, and that is the idea of a cognitive bias. So here the idea is not that people are basically motivated to arrive at certain conclusions, but the idea would be that people are selectively exposed to information. So we are usually in social networks where many people actually share our own views. And if we now make inferences from our social context, we might arrive at biased conclusion of what the public overall thinks. It's just the case that in our networks, the views that are similar to ours are overrepresented as compared to the population at large. And both of these mechanisms might apply and might explain why we see this tendency of human beings to hold false consensus beliefs. And what is important for us is that there might be a reason to think that these false consensus beliefs have become more important over time due to the idea of selective exposure becoming more important due to a change in media environments where people select more into the kind of information they consume. So there's reason to believe that with people selecting more which information they want to consume, they are more exposed to views that are similar to their own views. So we might expect to see a rise in these false consensus beliefs. And there's actually some work which seems to document this, showing that there's an association between social media use and people holding false consensus beliefs. So people who spend more time on social media hold more false consensus beliefs. So there's reason to think that this phenomenon might have become more important over time with regard to political views. Now, there's not really much research on false consensus beliefs within political science. There's some research which looks at the level of political elites. This research shows that this idea of false consensus bias also applies to politicians. Politicians hold beliefs that are systematically biased towards their own views. And this is obviously problematic from a democratic point of view, because if we want elites to be responsive to majority preferences, we might need elites who have accurate perceptions of what the public actually wants. And when these beliefs are biased, we might see less responsiveness than we would see otherwise. Where there's even less research is on the citizen level and on the consequences that false consensus beliefs might have on the citizen level especially. And our idea here is that this is really something that has been overlooked, because if we think about how citizens assess democratic legitimacy, we should think about what they think the public wants overall. We think that individuals not only think about democratic legitimacy from the point of view of their own preferences, but that they also think about what the public wants overall. And this leads us to believe that we should look at what citizens believe are the preferences of the public. And in the extreme, we can think of situations where people actually hold minority views, but believe that these views are widely shared. And if this is the case, they might think that politicians are not responsive to what the public wants, when actually elites might be responsive to what the real majority is. So we could think that this bias might be a problem for how citizens assess democratic legitimacy. And citizens who hold these false consensus beliefs might be more prone to question democratic legitimacy. And in the paper, we specifically look at populist attitudes because we think there the connection is especially clear. And if we talk about populist attitudes, we follow this understanding of the ideational approach to populism, where populism basically denotes support for a certain type of ideas. And these ideas would be mainly the belief that there's a genuine will of the people and that there are certain corrupt elites which prevent this general will of the people from being implemented into political decisions. And now our idea is that this populist viewpoint becomes more convincing to people who overestimate public agreement with their own views. So as I said already, with regard to democratic legitimacy, we can think of situations where people really hold minority views that are only supported by a few others. But if these individuals then think that these beliefs are widely shared by large majorities, they might perceive politics as unresponsiveness to what they think is a general will of the public. But there might actually be no such general will of the public. It might just be the case that people do not have accurate perceptions of what the public wants. And as citizens who hold false consensus beliefs perceive politics as unresponsive to what they think is the general will, they may then form populist attitudes. So our main hypothesis here is that the higher level of an individual's false consensus beliefs, the higher is their level of populist attitudes. And that's what we test in the paper. There's one previous paper that is kind of related to what we do. This is a paper by Anne Schulz et al., which looks at the association between populist attitudes and false consensus beliefs, but which is different in one important respect. So they look at false consensus beliefs measured as an attitude. So they have a scale where you can see the items here, give these items to individuals, and then see how much people agree with these items, and then correlate this with populist attitudes. And they do find an association, meaning populist attitudes tend to go hand in hand with people holding such false consensus attitudes. But what we do differently in our paper is we look at basically a factual measure of individuals' false consensus beliefs, and we arrive at that measure by asking people for their numerical assessments of public opinion on specific issues. So we are really interested in these beliefs and not in an attitude, because this attitude is conceptually very close to populist attitudes, and we think it's better to ask people what they really think are the public's preferences on certain issues, and to then measure the level of false consensus belief that an individual holds. And this is also the standard approach in research on false consensus beliefs, and we apply it in our paper to this question regarding the connection between false consensus beliefs and populist attitudes. So how do we test this hypothesis? We use items from the German GESIS panel. The important thing here for us is that this is really a high quality panel, meaning that it's a large panel, and also that it is reasonably representative of the German population at large. So we can really think that we have a good sample that approximates the German public overall. And we included our items in two waves. In the first wave, we asked individuals for their own opinion on certain issues and how they perceive public opinion on these issues. And then in a separate wave, we asked people for their populist attitudes. To go a bit more into the detail of how we measured these concepts, so we asked in the first step, are you for or against the proposed measures? I will show them on the next slide. And then we asked in an open question format people for their estimate of the share of those who are in favor of the respective measures, and asked people to enter a number between 0 and 100, which most people actually managed to do. So more than 95% actually managed to put in a number between 0 and 100, which is quite nice for us because we could analyze these data. These are the proposals we looked at. I won't discuss them in detail here. The important thing for us is that we try to include a diverse set of items. So our goal was to create a situation where it's not the same people who always end up in the minority position. And we were largely successful with that, with these diverse items here. This slide here shows you that there actually is this tendency to hold false consensus beliefs in the German public, or at least among our respondents. So what you see here are the distributions of people's estimates of public opinion. And you see separate distributions depending on what individuals' own opinions are. For example, if you look at the COVID item here, we see that people who are in favor of lifting the corona restrictions tend to think that most others are also in favor of lifting these restrictions, whereas those who are against lifting the restrictions have a much lower estimate in tendency of the number of people who are in favor of lifting COVID measures. And we always see this tendency. So the blue line is in a separate place than the red line. And people who fall in the middle category actually tend to estimate public opinion as being between these two distributions. So we really see that people who have different opinions have different estimates of what the public overall wants. So in the next step, it's important for us to put this into one measure of false consensus beliefs per individual. And I will talk now about how we did this. So I show you that we actually used 3 different measures because it's not straightforward how to do this. So our idea was to use several measures to see whether our results are robust to different ways of measuring these false consensus beliefs. And the first idea is to basically look at the mean error that people make that is in the direction of their own opinion. So we can define the error that people make. And this is just the difference between the estimate approval and the actual approval that we see in our survey. And this gives us the error that people make. And that could be in both directions. And now what we do is we basically count only the errors that are in the expected direction, that are in the direction of false consensus bias. So if I'm in favor of something, that would be an overestimate of the people who are in the public are also in favor of this. And for the other people, we basically set this value to 0 for the people who make the error in the wrong direction. And then we take an average of this value. So this gives us the average error that people make that is in the direction of their own opinion. That's one way to measure it. And we think it's more intuitive than other things that we could do, especially the third one, which is more complex. An even simpler measure that we use is basically just a count measure. So this counts just how often an individual holds a minority position, but believes that the proposal is supported by more than 50%. And this is then just a fraction. So that could happen every time for all 7 issues. You are in the minority, but believe that it's more than 50% of the public who approve of this measure. We don't have such a person in the data set, I guess, but that's the idea of how this works. And then we use a third type of measure, which is a bit more complex, where we run a regression model, a multi-level regression model, and basically have the error as a dependent variable and explain this with people's own opinions. And this gives us a coefficient which tells us the amount of projection that are going on in people's minds. So how much can we explain the error that people make by their own opinions? This could also be a nice measure of the degree of false consensus bias. So we save these regression coefficients and use this as a measure of false consensus beliefs. And we have 2 versions of that. One with all negative values being set to 0, because we are not really interested in people making errors in the wrong direction. We are interested in people who hold false consensus beliefs and in the strength of these false consensus beliefs. So we only look in one version of this measure at the positive values in these regression coefficients. So this is a bit complex, but just to ensure that our results are robust to using separate measures, and I'm also happy to discuss these in the Q&A. Populist attitudes are measured in a usual fashion. So we use the items from Ackermann et al. And we do a factor analysis and use a factor that we then scale to range from the 0 to 1. 1 would be maximum populist attitudes, and 0 would be the minimum value that you could have. And now let me come to the results. So what do we find? We see here just the bivariate associations between false consensus beliefs and populist attitudes. And there are 4 different plots, because we have these 4 different measures of people's false consensus beliefs. And on the y-axis, each time it's the populist attitude scale by Ackermann et al. And we see for each of these plots that there's a positive correlation as expected, that people who score higher on false consensus beliefs tend to have higher values of populist attitudes. So in the next step, what we did was to put this into a regression framework to allow us to integrate additional independent variables. And for these models, we looked at some socio-demographic characteristics like gender, age, education, but we also looked at political interest. And most crucially, we also controlled for the individual issue positions that individuals have. So it could be that some people are more populist just because they have certain issue positions, and it's not about false consensus beliefs per se. In order to be able to distinguish these effects, we not only include these measures of false consensus beliefs, but also the individual issue positions that individuals have. And we again see here a statistically significant positive correlation. People with higher false consensus beliefs tend to score higher on populist attitudes. And this holds for all of these four measures. So in the next step, we asked whether this actually holds for all people, no matter where they are placed on the left-right scale. And this is what you can see here, where we ran regressions where we interacted false consensus beliefs with the individual self-placement on the left-right scale. On the left-hand side, we here have the mean values of false consensus beliefs, and this is our main measure, the first measure that we use here. And on the right-hand side, we have the conditional effect of false consensus beliefs on populist attitudes. And we can see here that basically the effect holds across the left-right spectrum. So there's a positive effect of false consensus beliefs on populist attitudes, no matter where you are placed on the left-right scale, but it's really strongest for people here on the far right. That is what we can see. And also the level of false consensus beliefs is highest for people who are placed on the far right. Next, we try to see whether this might not only about populist attitudes, but also about political support more broadly. As I said, we might think that false consensus beliefs might lead to lower perceived democratic legitimacy overall. Our idea was that the connection is strongest with regard to populist attitudes, but we also find that people who hold false consensus belief tend to have lower external efficacy, lower political trust. We also see a negative coefficient for satisfaction with democracy, but that one is not statistically significant. So in a last step, we asked whether this might also translate into voting behavior. So might people who hold false consensus beliefs, might they be more prone to vote for populist parties? And in the German context we studied, we looked at voting for the AfD, and we distinguished between voting for the AfD and any other party. And in another version, we looked at voting for the AfD versus another mainstream party. So we basically just excluded the smaller parties, the very small parties, some of which might also be populist. And we run logistic regressions and then looked at the average marginal effects here. And we see that there might be some effect also on voting for AfD, that people who hold false consensus beliefs might be more likely to vote for the populist Alternative for Germany party. But this result is not that robust. So here it really depends on which measure of false consensus beliefs we use. For the other results, it doesn't really matter. So the results are robust across all measures of false consensus beliefs. So to wrap this up, yeah, we think we have empirical evidence of a robust association between false consensus beliefs and populist attitudes. And we also have some evidence showing us that this might extend to other measures of political support. And we think it shows us that some individuals may in fact develop populist attitudes because they overestimate how many others hold positions similar to their own. And that makes this populist sentiment more attractive to these people who hold these wrong beliefs. And one obvious implication here might be that we could reduce populist attitudes if we would be successful in convincing people of holding more accurate and more balanced perceptions of public opinion. So everything that helps, that reduces this egocentric bias might also help to reduce populist attitudes, and that might be an important angle to think about when it comes to the question of how to reduce populist attitudes. The elephant in the room, I guess, here is a bit the question of reverse causality. So what we do in the paper is we test whether there is a connection between false consensus beliefs on the one hand and populist attitudes on the other, but it's really hard to rule out that there might be a reverse causal arrow going from populist attitudes to false consensus beliefs, or there might be something else causing both. What we do in the paper is to really establish whether this correlation is robust by also including individuals' views on the issues, and to see whether it also applies to other measures of political support. But it's surely hard to really be certain about the causal arrow in this type of setup where we have survey data and can just do these correlational analysis. So what we want to do in further research is to look at interventions where we want to try to reduce these false consensus beliefs, and then see whether this has any downstream consequences. So if we have interventions in survey experiments that successfully reduce false consensus beliefs, does this also lead to lower levels of populist attitudes, or generally higher levels of political support? And with that, I'm looking forward to any questions or comments that you may have, and thank you for your attention.